Holland. Half of its land has literally been stolen from the icy waters of the North Sea. And Dutch engineers who led that effort became the world's best at building massive barriers and huge moving structures to reclaim the land. But now, Holland faces a new enemy. Climate change is driving the North Sea to record levels and pushing rivers over their banks. Can the Dutch masters of the water engineer their way out of this one? Or is this the end of 2,000 years of history? The day when the sea finally takes back what is hers. Perched precariously on Europe's western coast, Holland, its official name is the Kingdom of the Netherlands, has been locked in an epic struggle with the raging waters of the North Sea. The sea has made Holland rich, with abundant fisheries and access to the wealth of other lands. But the North Sea is also a ticking saltwater time bomb, threatening to wash the country away. And it's not just windmills and tulips that are in peril, but also world-class cities like Amsterdam and Rotterdam, the busiest port in the world, which could be drowned at any moment unless something is done to turn the tide. Holland's ultimate fate may lie in the hands of its engineers, who must decide where and when to engage the watery enemy. At critical places like the southern coast, where the world's longest dam with doors may stop the next devastating storm surge, saving thousands of lives. And the mouth of the Rhine River, where engineers have designed the largest robot on the planet to halt the water in its tracks. But are these remarkable feats of engineering enough to keep Holland safe? Once they might have been. But today there's a new threat: climate change on a global scale. Increasing temperatures across the planet have caused sea levels to rise, triggering vicious new storms that hammer coastal communities and send mighty rivers rushing over their banks. Can any human effort to resist hope to prevail? Certainly, if anyone can make a stand against nature's fury, the Dutch can. They've been fighting and winning a war against the water that began 2,000 years ago. Dutch builders have had to fight for every inch of their territory, draining swamps and erecting dams. And their labors have paid off. Over the centuries, Holland has nearly doubled its original size, filling in the swampy wasteland that once stretched 20 miles from the edge of the land to the coastal dunes. The swampy land turned out to be extremely fertile, nourished by one of the world's mightiest rivers, the Rhine. Sweeping down from its source in the Alps, the river weaves nearly 900 miles before emptying into the North Sea. Along the way, the Rhine regularly floods the low-lying land, depositing nutrients into the soil and creating rich cropland for anyone willing to do the hard work of draining it. The first settlers made their homes on small raised mounds near the seashore. Occasionally, the fertile land between the mounds flooded, cutting residents off from one another. To protect the land, farmers eventually began to build primitive dikes, low walls designed to keep the tide out and keep the land dry. The Dutch called these reclaimed fields polders. And little by little, the tiny settlements grew. But there was a problem. Over time, as the new land dried out, it settled, slowly sinking below sea level. making it impossible to drain off rain and seeping groundwater. Eventually, the water would reclaim the land. Things continued this way until the 1600s, when a remarkable invention began to turn the tide, literally. The windmill. These picturesque tourist attractions are actually sophisticated machines, the world's first large-scale wind-powered pumps. When covered with canvas, the mill's blades become sails that grab winds gusting in from the North Sea and convert them into raw pumping power through a series of huge gears that turn a massive water wheel below. 400 years ago, they were cutting-edge technology, offering the best solution yet to Holland's drainage problem. But there's a limit to how high a single windmill can lift the water. So engineers next began to arrange the mills in groups over a network of canals, each pumping the water gradually upward, from the lowest point on the bottom land to the top of the dikes, where it spilled into a canal or river and flowed out to the sea. With the added power of windmills, the Dutch could now steal vast tracts of new land from the sea, and modern Holland began to take shape. Today, the windmills have been replaced by modern diesel and electric pumps. Day in and day out, thousands of these pumps churn away, wringing the water out of Holland's soil, pumping nearly 5 trillion gallons per year. Enough water to satisfy New York City's needs for nearly a decade. Coming up on Extreme Engineering, desperate times call for desperate measures. But in a strange way, their very success exposed the Dutch people to an even greater danger. Because the faster the land was drained, the faster it sank. That has created a potentially disastrous situation for a country already dangerously below sea level. In the past century alone, Holland has sunk by nearly 2 feet. The only thing holding back the rivers and the sea are man-made dikes. Massive barriers, some of them 20 feet tall, and coastal dunes. These are a constant concern to the millions of people who depend on them for survival. If one of these barriers were to suddenly fail, the crashing cascade of water would erase everything in its path. Over the centuries, floods have killed hundreds of thousands of people in Holland, literally reshaping the country overnight. The worst flood on record hit in the year 1287, when the North Sea surged across the dikes protecting North Holland, killing hundreds of people. That North Sea flood changed Holland forever, carving a brand new inlet, the Zuider Zee, deep into the country. On the banks of the Zuider Zee, the Dutch founded Amsterdam, which would grow into a world-class trading and cultural center. But floods plagued the new capital city. As recently as 1916, the North Sea surged into the Zuider Zee, smashing dikes and inundating thousands of homes just north of Amsterdam. With so much valuable property underwater and the city at stake, Dutch authorities had finally had enough. They decided to find a way to tame this angry arm of the North Sea. For help, they turned to a visionary engineer, Cornelius Lely. He proposed an audacious plan, Holland's first extreme engineering project of the modern era. He would slice the northern inlet in two with a structure of unheard-of size. A 19-mile-long dike across one of the most storm-racked stretches of water in the world. On one side would be the raging sea. On the other side, a new freshwater lake called the IJsselmeer. But could he do it? Or would Amsterdam have to one day succumb to a North Sea flood?
Nobody really could guarantee that it would come to a successful end. It was actually sort of dangerous project. So many people were involved, so many technique was involved, so many new techniques were involved.
In April 1927, Lely and his engineers began to construct the giant dike. It was the start of a massive national effort that would touch the lives of every Dutch citizen. The plan was to erect a pair of clay walls, 100 yards apart. The trough running between them would be filled in during the final stages of construction. But the clay walls would have no chance of surviving unless they could be protected from the powerful North Sea tides. So thousands of workers wove a massive web of brushwood and willow branches. Workers assembled 1.5 million square yards of this covering, which would protect the sea floor and the sides of the dike itself from erosion. As the giant wooden webs sank into position, workers anchored them in place with millions of tons of rock. With the clay walls secured, engineers began to pump 250 million cubic feet of sand into the gap, enough to form an artificial beach 100 yards wide, stretching 19 miles. As a final layer of armor, workers laid millions of tons of stone along the dike's outer walls. Finally, on May 28, 1932, 5 years after the project began, workers sealed the last gap in the dike. Cornelius Lely had scored a stunning victory for Holland against the North Sea. But he was not done yet. Behind the dam, in the new inland lake, he went on to build more dikes to enclose large portions of the old North Sea inlet. Then he sent in the pumps. Over the next 40 years, the Dutch drained nearly 500,000 acres of ancient seabed, creating 4 new territories, the largest addition to Holland in history. The new northern closure dike stood as a shining triumph of extreme engineering. And for the first time, the Dutch felt safe from the constant threat of flooding. But 90 miles to the south, disaster was brewing in a marshy region where the Rhine and Meuse rivers split into tiny branches before spilling into the North Sea. During World War II, Allied bombers had targeted this region to deny the Nazis an important strategic foothold. When the war ended, the dikes were in bad repair. But they were the only barrier standing between the raging North Sea and some of Holland's oldest reclaimed lands. And then, on February 1st, 1953, the worst happened. 80-mile-an-hour winds from the North Sea began to push a mountain of water towards the weakened dikes in the south. Pounded by 16-foot waves, the dikes eventually gave way. One village, Ouwerkerk, was nearly wiped off the face of the earth. Because the first dike gave way after dark, most villagers had no way of knowing that the North Sea's attack had begun. Trapped in their homes, many fled to their attics. But that was not high enough. Whole families were crushed or drowned as their houses collapsed. Nico Portvliet was one of the lucky few who survived.
Father had his hammer and his chisel, so when we were in the top of the house, he could make a hole in the roof so that we could get outside. Because he said, we will be trapped just like rats. And that was just what happens with my grandmother a few houses away.
By daybreak, the sea had demolished 70 dikes and pushed 45 miles inland. Nearly 2,000 people perished. It would take 10 months to repair the dikes and pump out the seawater. But for some, the memory of the tragedy would endure far longer.
People who made it through, they can say, no, remember, it can always happen again.
The disaster was a major setback for the Dutch. Clearly, the dike across the Zuider Zee was not sufficient to protect the country. Builders realized that they would have to construct another massive barrier, this time in the south. But there was a problem. The southern coast had not one, but several inlets to protect, presenting an engineering challenge far more daunting than anything builders had ever before faced. In 1958, engineers devised a plan and work began. Over the next 30 years, engineers painstakingly built barrier after barrier, creating new inland lakes and redirecting rivers. Finally, only one opening remained. But it was the largest inlet of them all, a potential backbreaker. The tides here surged with incredible force. Even so, engineers pushed forward with a traditional dike, like the others they had just completed. But just as construction began, the project took an unexpected turn. For the first time ever, the Dutch public began to question the methods employed by their heroic builders. Because building a dike across this inlet would have caused the destruction of a fragile ecosystem, threatening the local fishing industry. So engineers stopped building and set out to try to find a new approach, one that would protect the land without decimating the coastal fishing industry. Spurred by these new demands, Dutch engineers came up with an ingenious proposal.
It was decided to build an open structure that would only be closed during extreme storm surges. And building in those hostile conditions, that was really difficult. At the same time, there was time pressure. So a lot of research and development had to take place during the construction phase even.
Ahead on extreme engineering, can engineers hold back nature's fury? It would be a dam like no other, because it wouldn't attempt to block the flow of water unless a devastating storm surge threatened. The proposed structure would be the world's longest dam with doors, more than 60 of them, each weighing as much as 40 fully loaded railroad boxcars, hung between 65 gargantuan piers. Under normal conditions, each door would remain in the up position, allowing the North Sea to flow underneath. But if sea levels rose to dangerous heights during a storm, the doors would be lowered to the sea floor, sealing off inland Holland from the storm surge. No structure this complex had ever before been built in the sea, in an area with such strong tides. Builders feared that super strong currents would tear the structure apart before they could anchor it to the sea floor. Currents this strong would make the sea bottom unstable because they rip away the fine sand.
Twice a day the water flows in and out at high velocity, and building a structure in there is quite a task. The bottom is formed of sediments, fine sediments that move around constantly.
To better understand how the current affected the sea floor, scientists came to a laboratory like this. A technician places a measuring device into a test tank. The bottom of the tank is lined with sediments similar to those at the bottom of the North Sea inlet. The only force turning the propeller is the moving water. When the water's speed increases to that of the currents in the North Sea inlet, the sediments begin churning wildly. For Dutch designers of the southern dam, the lessons were painfully clear. If they tried to build the dam directly on the floor of the inlet, the shifting sands would topple it. They had to come up with another way of securing their massive dam. They turned to the Zuiderzee dike for inspiration. Here, designers countered the force of the currents by placing huge willow mats on the sides of the dam and on the seafloor. Could a similar technique save the southern dam? Engineers believed it could. But this time, instead of hand-weaving the mats from willow branches, they constructed a huge factory on a channel island to manufacture the protective coverings on a massive scale. The 1-foot-thick mats began with a long plastic foundation, which was filled with gravel and covered with another plastic sheet. As the factory scrambled to produce enough mats, shipyards launched 3 new construction vessels specially designed for the project. And in a huge dry dock created on a channel island, the massive piers took shape. Each pier was as tall as an 11-story building and weighed a whopping 18,000 tons. The same as a nuclear submarine. These engineering marvels would form the backbone of the new barrier. But first they had to be put in their proper places, and that would be a daunting undertaking. Because the tides flowing into and out of the inlet were simply too powerful for standard construction work. But there was a brief period each day when the current could be overcome. When the outgoing tide paused before rushing back in. But it was only the narrowest of windows, a mere 30 minutes. That meant that engineers would have only 2 half-hour periods a day when they could assemble the dam in the water. If they were to succeed, they would have to move with clock-like precision. First, from the back of a ship, they unfurled the 100-foot-wide foundation mats, which came to rest on the unstable sea floor. Now, another ship maneuvered one of the huge piers into position to lower it onto the waiting mat below. With only 30 minutes to complete the work, there was no room for error.
It's so difficult to place that right in the right place, just only a few centimeters away from the spot where it should be. And we were lucky we did it.
Then, a custom-designed scooping crane placed 5 million tons of rock around the edges of the dam to anchor the mats and brace the piers against any blow. Next came an equally demanding task: installing the huge doors, each weighing 400 tons. By 1987, the storm surge barrier was complete. All 65 piers and their gates were in position, with a brand new highway running along the top. The most sophisticated dam ever built. Its designers are confident it will last for 200 years. But can it really stand up to the full force of the North Sea?
When the big storm comes, you can imagine it's enormous. It's really enormous. When wind force 11 stands on the barrier with all the big waves up to 3 or 4 or even 5 meters, it's an enormous power. You really must feel it.
During a storm, computers monitor the rising seas. When a storm surge reaches 10 feet above median sea level, an alarm goes out to the emergency control team. They give the command to lower the doors, sealing off the inlet. As of 2002, the dam has had to slam shut 21 times, protecting the coast and saving countless lives. It's a victory for those who remember the terrible flood of 1953. Like Nico Portfleet, the young village boy who grew up to be the current supervising engineer on the dam.
There is a kind of special feeling working on this barrier. You can imagine that.
With the completion of the southern barrier, Holland was better protected from the North Sea than ever. Yet there remained one glaring gap in Holland's formidable defenses: the narrow channel that led up the Rhine River to the port of Rotterdam, the busiest seaport in the world. Every 6 minutes, another ship enters or exits the harbor. Over a year, that's more than 80,000 vessels, hauling more than 320 million tons of cargo. If a major storm surge were to come barreling up the Rhine, it would flood Rotterdam with more than 16 feet of water. Worse still, the sea would inundate a huge area to the north, the most densely settled part of Holland, home to more than 5 million people. The Dutch knew that they had to protect this strategic port, no matter what the cost. The problem was, no one could figure out how to design a storm barrier that wouldn't also restrict the flow of ships and goods.
Next up on Extreme Engineering, it's robotics to the rescue as the world's largest surge barrier is assembled.
In 1991, a new generation of engineers took up the challenge to build a storm surge barrier large enough to protect the port in an emergency, but kept out of the way until needed. They came up with a revolutionary design: a pair of massive barriers that could swing into place across the river when needed, shielding the port from an approaching storm surge. Each barrier would be attached to the end of a massive arm of steel tubes. And each of these huge arms would have a shoulder, a ball and socket pivot that allows it to swing its barrier into place. To test the design, engineers experimented with a scale model in a lab. Like the model, the actual steel barriers would be hollow, allowing them to float on the surface of the water. Once they've swung into place, they would be filled with water and sink to the bottom, sealing off Rotterdam from the approaching flood. Overall, a stunningly simple design, but very difficult to build.
The first test we did showed tremendous instabilities of the whole structure, simply due to the current that's going under the barrier while we bring it into position. The barrier was absolutely out of control.
The bobbing motion of the model appears slight, but it means that the real barrier would heave up and down 30 feet, possibly tearing the structure apart. So engineers redesigned the underside of each barrier to try to reduce the turbulence below. But no one could know for sure if this change would be enough. Finally, they were ready to begin building. First, they constructed a gigantic dry dock on each side of the river. The huge chambers mirrored the curved form of the barriers. Then, the giant steel tubes that would form the barrier's arms arrived. The largest tubes were 100 feet long and 6 feet in diameter, big enough for a person to stand up in. Welding each joint took 6 days and had to be perfect. Just one bad weld on a moving structure weighing 14,000 tons would be catastrophic. Meanwhile, in a factory in the Czech Republic, workers cast the most critical components. The two steel spheres, each 33 feet in diameter, that would form the shoulder joints for the huge steel arms. The finished spheres arrived by sea, suspended at the end of a massive crane, the huge sockets ready to receive them. These ball and sockets are a remarkable feat of precise engineering. They are designed to function smoothly under the 70,000 tons of pressure that a powerful storm surge can generate. In 1997, 6 years and almost $3 billion after work began, Rotterdam finally had its storm surge barrier. Holland's Queen Beatrix christened the barrier, which would now get its first full test run. Would the design work, or would it be ripped apart as it moved? It worked. But those waters were calm. The real test will come the first time it has to close during a massive storm. And when that time comes, the barrier will move without human help. Because the barrier is not only the largest moving object ever made, it is also the largest robot in the world.
All the machinery is started automatically by the computer, without any human interference. So in that sense, it's the largest robot.
Day in and day out, the barrier's computers stand watch over the waterway, analyzing the latest weather and oceanographic data, searching for an approaching storm. As of 2002, the barrier had not yet closed in an emergency. But that good luck may end soon, because Holland's weather is changing. Storms are growing more vicious with each passing year.
Next up on Extreme Engineering, engineers look to the city of New Orleans for answers.
The raging North Sea has forced the southern dam to lower its doors 10 times more than planners had originally predicted. And if the weather continues to worsen, intense storms like those found only in the tropics could make their way to Holland. The heavy rains they bring could turn once friendly rivers into deadly foes, opening a brand new front in the war on water. Hardest hit would be Holland's heartland. Small farming villages like Ogden on the Rhine River. Like the beating of a great heart, floods have moved in and out with the seasons, tracing a predictable rhythm. For centuries, the dikes have protected the town and farmland during these floods. But in the winter of 1995, that pattern suddenly broke. Unusually heavy rains soaked the countryside. The water drained into the Rhine, causing it to rise. The river reached its usual peak level, but then it kept going.
The dike began to tear up. The level of the river was till here. It was a very dangerous situation. I get the advice to evacuate immediately.
It was a critical moment. The swollen river threatened to overwhelm the dikes and inundate the village.
There would have been a wall of water destroying all the houses in a circle of about 1 kilometer. That would have meant for the village of Ogden, of about 3,000 people, that it would have been washed away.
But the flood never came. The river stopped rising and slowly receded. Was this near miss nothing more than a once-in-a-century threat? If global warming is a reality, the worst may be yet to come.
Our showers now will become more tropical, and that means that the tropical intensities will appear here. If you travel to the south, then you know that the tropical showers are way more intense than our showers in the north.
Will increased rainfall force Holland to face a war on two fronts? Against both an angrier North Sea and flooding rivers? To learn what the future may bring, some Dutch planners have looked elsewhere, to a place closer to the tropics, where engineers have been locked in a similar struggle for nearly a century. New Orleans, Louisiana. This city is famous for its nightclubs and casinos, but the real gamble here plays for far higher stakes. The city is under siege from water on all sides, and engineers may be powerless to fend off disaster. Like much of Holland, New Orleans sits on land reclaimed from water. In this case, the Mississippi River. And also like Holland, the city has been sinking over the centuries. Not only that, nearby Lake Pontchartrain crowds New Orleans from the north. Both the river and the lake are poised to pour destruction on the city below. Only giant levees, similar to Holland's dikes, keep the city from being drowned. But New Orleans also faces a huge danger that Holland doesn't, at least not yet: hurricanes. These enormous storm systems pack incredible power.
A hurricane would be equivalent to hundreds of nuclear bombs in terms of the amount of energy released. So even if we dropped our biggest nuclear bomb on a hurricane, it wouldn't even feel it. It would just keep right on going.
Hurricanes gather strength far out to sea. And as they approach land, they drive a wall of water before them. These storm surges can be even more destructive than the North Sea floods in Holland. In fact, the largest storm surge ever recorded, a devastating wall of water 23 feet high, slammed into the Gulf Coast in 1969. Driven by the 180-mile-per-hour winds of Hurricane Camille, the storm surge killed 250 people in Mississippi. Even so, it could have been much worse. Had the hurricane veered just slightly to the west and hit New Orleans, it could easily have killed 100 times as many people. The storm would have first driven a wall of water from the Gulf of Mexico into Lake Pontchartrain, then scooped up the contents of the lake and heaved it over the levees onto the city below. It would have been a flood unlike any the city had seen before.
What I'm doing is using a surveying rod to illustrate how high the water would get during a Category 5 storm, or the worst case. Now, the top of the rod is 20 feet, and that's the elevation of the water we expect to see during a Category 5 storm.
A flood like this might claim the lives of up to 40,000 people. To prevent such a catastrophe, engineers know they need a barrier large enough to prevent the ocean from surging into Lake Pontchartrain during a hurricane. But none of the Dutch designs prove practical. Neither a massive dike nor a movable barrier. Because there are simply too many places for the water to force itself in when driven by a massive hurricane.
We have to understand what's happening in the environment, because we cannot out-engineer such things as hurricanes. They're just too big.
It seemed that New Orleans was doomed. But then, engineers realized that nature itself might provide the solution. By way of the Mississippi River. Each day, the river dumps 700 million gallons of water into the Gulf of Mexico. With that water flow thousands of tons of sediment, clearly visible from space as a massive reddish deposit at the river's mouth. If engineers could let the Mississippi carry some of that mud into the swamps that border the lake, the river might gradually build up a natural surge barrier, far larger than any man-made structure. The plan signals a remarkable change of heart as engineers release the river to flood some of the land. It's a lesson for Holland, where rivers might be the key to fending off future disaster. That scenario might look something like this. The year is 2050, and tropical strength storms, spawned by global warming, now routinely hammer northern Europe. After weeks of rain, the Rhine is already swollen, and runoff is gushing into the North Sea. Then, the unheard of happens. A second massive storm approaches Holland from the North Sea. The high winds drive a wall of water towards the vulnerable coast. Word goes out to close the southern barrier dam. Emergency crews at the Zuiderzee Dam anxiously monitor the mounting storm surge. The movable Rotterdam barrier swings into place. Without these engineering marvels, the country would certainly be doomed. The sea would quickly reclaim nearly half of Holland. Hour after hour, the storm surge grows, but the barriers hold. It begins to seem that the Dutch will escape unscathed. But then, the news along the Rhine takes a chilling turn. The river is rising, rapidly. The dikes give way at a dozen places, and hundreds of communities are flooded. But engineers are out of ammo. They have no way to hold back the water. So they make a fateful decision. For the first time in more than 2,000 years, they surrender. They cut their losses and relinquish some of the land. They won't try to fight the flood. Instead, they will try to manage it. They will divert the rivers away from the most densely settled areas, allowing the water to spill into farmland. The cost will be high, but by giving in, they will preserve their hard-won nation. This is how the Dutch are preparing for the future today. Engineers are already marking some areas as potential floodplains. In the war on water, it's a tactical retreat, but not a defeat. Because for the Dutch, the water is both foe and friend. And they owe their history to the struggle for balance between the two.